So typically, the way we marry the cattle and the sheep is we have a 1.5 acre holding pen, and typically we only get anywhere from 15 to 20 open yearling heifers, and we try to do like a 2-to-1 ratio of cattle to sheep, and we'll put them in this holding pen together. Typically, sometimes it can happen in a day, sometimes it's two days. And we introduce them together, and they'll kind of chase each other around for a little bit. We feed them a couple times together. We'll get some sweet feed. And eventually, the chasing kind of ends, and they decide, we eat together. And after that, it's kind of smooth sailing. Kind of what we use for fencing. A lot of the fields out here actually have a solid border fence. So that's kind of helpful when we are in a field that does have a solid border fence. When for the cross fences, we use just like a typical poly wire or turbo wire. And kind of to start, usually the yearlings are really good. It's the sheep that kind of give you the trouble. So when I do start, I'll double poly wire, 2 hot wires. I'll kind of keep them lower, one a little bit higher, just so the yearlings don't just walk over it, but then we'll put one really low to the ground. And usually after a week, the sheep kind of realize that, this is a hot fence. We can't go through this fence without getting shocked. And then I'm actually able to just go down to 1 poly wire kind of in the middle. And usually there's not any problems. Sometimes if there's a storm or something, or they get riled up for some reason, there might be a couple sheep out. But usually they respect the fence. In terms of moving daily, right away it's a little bit of a struggle, just because they're coming from situations probably where they don't do that every day. So you kind of have to take your time with them. I'll take down 3 or 4 posts, which ends up being almost half the field, and pulling back the wire, and as smoothly as I can, and slowly as I can, as calmly as I can, will shift them to that next cell. And that usually takes a week or 2. But once they start understanding that, every day we're moving, sometimes it's as easy as I open up the gate. I don't even have to take down a post. I'll let them know that, hey, we're moving. Sometimes they see me and know they're moving, and eventually they just walk in themselves. And then at that point, the rest of the year is pretty simple. They hear me start up the side-by-side with the water trailer hooked up, and they're there, ready to go. Typically, we do graze a lot of different forages out here. We actually have a scale that we implement where we weigh our livestock after every forage type. And I would say usually we're weighing about 7 times. Some of the forages that we do graze, we always have a perennial field at Minokan Farm. We include perennials in our crop rotation, so that's been huge for us on the livestock side. On a good year, we're going to be able to graze that perennial a couple of times. We do also graze full season cover crops and crop residue, crop aftermath grazing. And then if we're lucky, early in the spring, we'll actually get a really early graze on like a winter rye or a winter rye and camelina mix. And that's been really good for us. Especially on a year like this year when we kind of had, I want to call it a wet year, but in reality it was just an average moisture year. We had a lot of biomass, and typically in a grazing situation where you're rotationally grazing, you're going to want to utilize about 50%. This year with the concentration of sheep and cattle that we had, and about 1/3 of an acre per day, we were actually getting a lot more trampling effect. So we were probably only utilizing, about 70%. And when I say utilizing it, we're actually utilizing the whole plant, but that animal is probably only getting the top 30% of that plant. But the sheep, they're such great tramplers because they're very concentrated, and I'm not sure if it's because of the small hoof, but they kind of stay in a tight flock, and when they move, they just when you look at it when you're not walking in it and you look at it from the side, it looks like, oh man, I really overgrazed. It's just flat down pressed. But then when you walk out there and start lifting up some of these plants that are pressed on the ground, you realize, well, I'm only grazing 30%, but all of these plants now are being put back into the soil, and you're building your soils, with the trampling. And I mean, cattle do a good job trampling too, but sheep, I don't think you're going to find a better animal for trampling. Determining forage is kind of a tricky question because it really depends on your forage type. It really depends on what kind of year you're having. I would say when I first started, I really stayed true to I tried to do a third of acre the best I could on all the forages, but now after been doing this for a few years, you kind of develop an eye for it, and it does take some time, and you're not going to get it right away, but at some point in time, you kind of understand that, okay, with this forage type, we have this much biomass, this is the amount of space I can give them for a day, and that's going to be different with a perennial compared to an early spring rye graze, or even compared to some of the full season cover crops we grow out here too, because the amount of biomass on those cover crops is quite large, or they wouldn't need such a large area. I would say on like our perennial field, it's 8 or 9 perennial mix, 8 or 9 species mix. I'd say on a good average year, we can probably do about a third of an acre a day. Maybe on a drier year, you're probably bumping that up to, maybe not quite a half an acre, but, a little more than a third. Yes, well, right. That then you're getting into your, your forage type. If you're grazing like a early season winter rye, you're not going to have a lot of biomass. There might be some high protein in that early growth, but the biomass isn't there. And a lot of times, I mean, you want high protein, or you don't want extremely high protein, but you want good nutrition in your forage. But I would say more importantly, you're looking at the biomass, because those critters have to eat. Even if it is really high in nutrient, they still have to consume a lot of material. So, and then as the summer goes on too, and those critters are getting bigger, they have to consume more material. So kind of in going back to our perennial, the first time through, when there's a huge amount of biomass, I might be able to cut down below a third of an acre the first time through, just because the massive amount of biomass. Now that second time through, the forage quality is probably going to be a little better. You're probably going to have a little higher protein, but you're not going to have the same amount of biomass, and your critters are going to be bigger. So you're not really gaining or losing just because of the factors of animals are getting bigger, although the nutrient density might be a little better, in that second growth. Your animals are bigger, so they need more to meet their requirements. That too, the recovery time really depends on, forage type and time of year you're grazing, and Mother Nature itself. I would say on an average year, on a perennial field, I would say you're at 60 days. You're probably pretty good. I seen this year we were a little wetter early on, and then we kind of didn't get any rain, and it averaged out. But we were wet early on. We were above average rainfall, and I think one of our perennial fields, it was like 45 days, and that it ended up working out really well for us. We didn't take 50%, we took 30%, and then we got a lot of really timely rains and good rains, multiple inches of rain. So it was able to recover quite quickly. But I would say on like a typical central North Dakota year, 60 days is probably a good, a good average. What's more important though is get out there, make sure you're in like the fourth leaf stage, and that once you hit that fourth leaf, you're probably recovered. You're not going to harm your root system, and that's when you could graze it again. The way we're watering right now, it's working, and it does work. And we kind of all joke about it here because it's kind of, it's definitely a rancher setup. But we have like a 1,500-gallon big water tank on a trailer. And then we fill that, midsummer we're filling it twice a week. Usually we can get a week out of it. But then we run that down into a garden hose, into a float that's hooked onto their 250-gallon, they're not chemical, but my brain instantly goes to chemical totes. They're cut in half. So we have about 250 gallons of water that are cut in half, fed by a float, fed by this tank, and then those are also on a shorter trailer. And early on, the cattle never have a problem reaching the tank. Early on, there's a ramp in the back, or the sheep might need to go up the ramp to kind of figure out what's going on. But once they know that, this is where I get water, we just, they can reach it, and there's usually not any problem. One thing I kind of wanted to mention with rotational grazing, kind of the reason why we do it, and kind of what our process, where our brain goes when we think of why are we doing this. And it kind of goes back to, if you read the Lewis and Clark journals, as they come up through North Dakota, they kind of describe the landscape, and they talk about these, at a glance, there's thousands of animals, and they're, in these big herds roaming the plains, and they're being chased around by, wolves and bears and other predators, keeping them constantly on the move, and we're talking, thousands of animals, and that's kind of how our soils evolved in this area, and by doing this, by grazing this way, we're trying to mimic that the best we can with high intensity, short frequency, and then long rest and recovery, typically to how like the bison would move across the plains. They would move in these massive herds and graze an area really hard, and then they would leave, and who knows when they'd come back. Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 3 years? That we don't exactly know, but we do know that they were definitely letting these areas rest and recover, and they certainly weren't grazing in the same area, all year round. So kind of going, back to why are we doing this? We're trying to treat our soils and our perennials, as they evolved over time in this area. So typically, when we're doing this rotational grazing, all the animals actually look really well. They look like they're doing great. Their body condition scores are good, and kind of tracking their weights through the year, pretty much consistently, they're gaining weight. We might find a forage here or there that they maybe don't perform super well on, but in the long term, they're not ever going backwards. They're typically always gaining weight. They appear to be in good body condition score. We don't use any sort of like insect repellent or any pour-ons or anything like that. And I think the daily moves help with that. I think, by the time those larvae are hatching in the pads, you're kind of 3 or 4 moves down. And I'm not saying that there's no flies. I mean, that would just be ridiculous, but it doesn't really seem to be a huge problem. Sometimes you go to these places and the livestock are just loaded with these flies, and we don't really see that out here. It could be too due to the fact that this year we did give a garlic type mineral, and that seemed to really help. I mean, there was basically no flies on the critters, but typically throughout the year the animals are in good condition. They never really seem bogged down or anything like that. They're actually quite energetic and excited to move when they see me coming. So well, right, and it actually brings up another point too with rotational grazing. I've actually noticed now Being here for a few years, the amount of wildlife that you actually see when you're out there moving. I mean, like you say, there's birds landing on the sheep, and sometimes the birds will be on top of the cattle. Toads everywhere in these perennials. I mean, hundreds of toads. This year was extremely high in toads, and those bring other animals in too. I've seen a lot of badger, gophers. Obviously, we've had fox out here, deer pass through, a lot of pheasants. I don't know the species of bird, but there was a big white bird in the perennial this year, and it was kind of funny. It always stayed one paddock back, and then I would come and move the cattle, and it'd fly away. And as soon as I left, that bird would be in that next paddock, probably eating toads. But it's kind of cool seeing what you're doing is actually beneficial to not only these cattle and your soil, but also to the wildlife in the area. Well, no, when you're determining how much you should graze, if you're looking to get that exact 50% mark, what you can do is you can go out there, go ahead a little bit, just cut some forage and balance it on your finger, and where it balances, that's your 50% mark. And your roots are going to be a little heavier, so sometimes it's not always exactly in the middle of where that plant is. So when you balance it, you kind of have to determine, you may actually be able to graze a little more than you think because of the heaviness of the bottom of that plant. So 50% doesn't always mean, exactly half the level of the plant. I mean, it's good to go out there and balance it, take a good amount of forage, different, if you're, take a sample that's representative of the forage. I mean, don't just pick, your biggest alfalfa plant and be like, oh, this is 50%. I mean, take a good representation and balance it and go by that. But I think a lot of time too, that's a very mathematical way to do it. But, as you do it, you start to develop, kind of an eye for it. And personally, sometimes when I graze 50% and I know it's 50%, I look at it and I almost think it's too much. And that's not, is it too much? Probably not. But sometimes you look at it and you're like, man, that's looking pretty stemmy. I don't know if maybe we need to take a little less in this particular forage. And then sometimes you're in situations where, kind of like an early spring rye where you're not really going to get a bunch of regrowth on that, because typically you would graze that rye and then we're probably coming in to seed a crop. So maybe in like that type situation, I may take a little more than 50%, just in terms of, well, I'm coming in here with a drill tomorrow to seed soybeans or something like that. But typically, in a situation where you're wanting regrowth, you're trying to build your soil, you're trying to give that plant the best opportunity to regrow and be healthy and to graze again, 50% is a good mark. Right. Well, yeah. So another way to determine it is if you're in the field and you're just kind of going for an eyeball, do the finger balance. If you're want to know exactly, well, what's my 50%? Take it 50% by weight. I mean, that'll be, if 50% by weight is going to be your exact 50% mark.